All right. We'll see how this works. This is my first official recording in Camtasia. If this seems like I am rushing, it might be because I actually am. I've got about 24 to 25 slides, and anytime I do a voiceover, I try not to go over 25 to 30 minutes. So let's get going here. All right, again, Chapter 6, Stages of Learning. I think this is one of the more important chapters because you need to understand where your learner is within the spectrum that we think, at least, is learning, right? So before we even talk about that, there's a few important caveats we want to understand when thinking about various stages of learning. One we should recognize is that there is not a clear delineation between every single stage. Instead, the stages kind of bleed into each other, right? You're not 100% in the cognitive stage, and you're not 100% in the associative stage. At times, you're probably somewhere on a spectrum, I don't know, 70%, 30%, something along those lines. Beyond that, right, a learner can be in different stages for different skills. So let's say we're talking about the sport of basketball, right? In the sport of basketball, somebody can be really, really good and relatively autonomous dribbling with their right hand, right? But if you look at them with their left hand, they may truly be in the cognitive or associative stage of learning with regards to their left hand. So then imagine in a practical setting, as a 6th grade basketball coach, you're trying to essentially have a tryout and you're putting out essentially grades for certain skills. If you just kind of have this global grading system of like dribbling, well, one person might be really good with the right hand, but what about the left hand, right? So you've got to consider these things. And then last consideration is to recognize that stages of learning are not dependent of age. Instead, they are truly independent of age. You could have somebody who's never done a skill whatsoever and be in the cognitive stage. Likewise, you could have a 5-year-old be in the associative stage of a given skill. It just simply depends. I think sometimes we kind of overlook that. All right, let's get going. So this chapter is going to emphasize 2 separate models of stages of learning. One is Fitz and Posner's 3-stage learning model. That's probably the one I personally reference a little bit more. And then you have Gentile's 2-stage learning model. So as you've already heard me allude to several times this semester, Fitz and Posner's 3-stage learning model has 3 stages: the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage, right? Where performance of movement is virtually automatic. I've got more slides for each, so let's speak a little bit about each stage. So the cognitive stage is obviously when a new skill is introduced, right? Our goal is first simply to understand the movement requirements, right? Imagine you are introduced to something like the barbell clean, right, as we've done in class. For many of you, you just don't understand kind of what it is. If I showed you maybe once and asked you what to do, right, you don't understand what is required of a given movement, right? When someone is in the cognitive stage, right, they are going to attempt numerous techniques and strategies to learn that skill, right? Think about when we were juggling, right? Many of you guys were like, okay, maybe I should try this, or should I throw the ball high or throw the ball low? I don't know. Should I break it up into part practice, right? So many of you were trying new things as you were learning. Beyond that, depending on the learner, another clear way to recognize if somebody is more so within the cognitive stage is they simply ask a lot of questions, right? And then additionally, when they are performing a given movement, it lacks synchronization and appears choppy, right? Very, very common. You take somebody who is highly skilled at a given movement, it's fluid, it's, in many cases kind of this work of art, but with regards to new learners, it sometimes can be choppy and again, kind of lacking synchronization. Other key aspects of the cognitive stage are attentional demands are high. If any of you have spent time recently learning a skill, what you'll recognize is it's kind of exhausting, right? Your attentional demands are so focused on certain things that it can be very, very exhausting. Additionally, they can't carry on any type of conversation typically. Performances are inconsistent and there are numerous errors. Again, connecting it back to juggling, right? Some of you may have maybe juggled with one hand 10 times in a row, right? But then on the next one, you only did it 2 times, maybe, right? So that's an example of an inconsistent performance, right? The learners may try to reformulate past experiences to try to solve the current problem. And as a practitioner, your goal should be, let's try to draw on past experiences to enhance the learning process. So what does that mean, right? We have an entire chapter which really looks at a phenomenon called transfer of training, right? As a practitioner, right, if you have this new skill, right, you should try to identify if there is something, a past experience in that learner that might help expedite the learning process. So the clear example here is, let's say, the overhand throwing motion. Right? In this, let's say you are in spring baseball season in middle school, we'll say, and someone say maybe hasn't thrown a baseball that often by middle school. Let's just imagine that, right? What you could say is, oh, you were a quarterback in football. Well, the overhand throwing motion is generally fairly similar. So you can perhaps use some of the similar cues to throw a football that might carry over to throwing a baseball, right? That's called transfer of training, and that's drawing on past experiences. I think the last one here is needs guidance from practitioner to detect and correct errors. And the 3 asterisks here are, they don't know that they're making mistakes often, right? So my example here is, over last summer, I tried to teach my daughter how to swim. At the time, she was 4 years old. It was very cool. In the beginning of the summer, she hated the water and didn't want to go in. By the end of the summer, she loved it, right? But, you know, at the end of the summer, right, I was trying to actually teach her bilateral breathing, where her face would be in the water and she would breathe on one side, right? And then she would do a couple strokes, and hopefully you guys could see me in this video. She would breathe on the other side, right? That's bilateral breathing. It's a very advanced skill, but the funny thing is, right, my daughter, as I would say, like, all right, this is what you got to do. You got to do this. She would start swimming, and she would have her head, in the water. But when she went to go to breathe to the side, right, her head went straight up and then back into the water. Straight up and then back into the water. And, you know, she would do, let's say, like a lap in the pool, and she would look at me and she would say, Daddy, did I do it? Did I do it? And sure enough, she wasn't able or capable of detecting the errors she was doing. So as an instructor, right, or a practitioner, oftentimes you need to point out the mistakes so the learners are now aware of that. Now, moving on to the associative stage, right? So what does the learner start to do? Well, they start to figure out what works best for them, right? There starts to be this level of consistency in a given movement pattern with fewer errors, right? So imagine we use volleyball here, capable of setting a ball, but not with perfect accuracy. So every time they can set it, but maybe they're not perfectly accurate, okay? Now that they're aware of the errors, they're better at detecting them and having strategies to correct them, right? So awareness is super important at the end of that cognitive stage as we enter the associative stage, right? All of a sudden, right, attentional demands start to lessen. Because of this, we can now potentially increase practice length, right? So instead of doing these like short, frequent practices, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes, maybe we could practice for 30 to 60 minutes at a time. New affordances are perceived. So remember, oftentimes we are talking about sports within this class, right? So the example here is, imagine a volleyball setter where they now learn, oh, I don't have to just set the ball straight up, we'll say, right? Now I could learn to set the ball behind me potentially. And then beyond that, and that's kind of what this video is, right? As an instructor or practitioner, right, your goal should be to manipulate key constraints in practice to create awareness of these new affordances, and then manipulate practice constraints, right, to enhance these new affordances, right? So create constructive practice experiences and effective feedback from the practitioner. All right, we're now in the autonomous stage, right? Now, some of you may say, okay, we're in the autonomous stage of learning, right? Remember, this is Fitz and Posner's 3-stage learning model. Oh, do they need me? Do they still need a coach or an instructor? And the answer is an emphatic yes, yes, yes. All right, we'll get to that in a little bit. But how do we recognize the autonomous stage? There's a high degree of proficiency, and then beyond that, consistent proficiency, right? They can perform multiple tasks simultaneously. Their attention can now be redirected more so to strategy or tactics. So for the example for volleyball is now someone, if they know they can set the ball behind them, maybe they actually do a fake to set the ball, I don't know, in front of them to disguise their movement or their intended plans for the opponents, right? They can now fully detect errors and even course correct on their own without the coach. And that's a highlight of instruction, where they can correct the errors on their own, right? This last bullet point kind of addresses that first thing I was talking about in that, right? Learners in the autonomous stage may become discouraged and unmotivated if proficiency comes slowly. So, as they get more advanced, right, that learning curve, which we're going to talk about at the end of the chapter, right, it really starts to slow down. So that rate of improvement, I should say, starts to slow down, which, you know, early on, it can be super motivating for someone because, I don't know, they're just getting better and better with every single attempt, and then inevitably every single practice session, and then every week they're making these improvements, right? But after months and years potentially of learning a skill, like, how are they going to continue to improve? Well, definitely not at the initial rate of which they learn that skill. And that can be discouraging. So as a practitioner, right, when people start to become a little bit more advanced, right, a major role of that practitioner is now to really serve as a motivator, right? And, you know, that's a completely different conversation in my opinion. All right, so now we're moving on to Gentile's 2-stage learning model, right? There's some similarities, but there's some key distinct differences as well, right? So what you'll see is the 2-stage model has the getting the idea of the movement stage, right, which has 2 different pieces, and then there's the fixation and diversification stage, right? So let's move on to the first stage, right, where the goal is, right, develop an understanding of the movement and its requirements, right? Organize a corresponding movement, right? And attend to relevant, right, regulatory cues versus our irregulatory cues, like distractions, things that don't really matter, right? Here, right, instruction and practice should facilitate the development of basic movement patterns. So again, you're trying to give them some information about the given movement, which is kind of similar, right? And sort of create that level of schema, right, for them to draw on and initiate a given movement pattern. This is where the learning model is a little bit different than Fitz and Posner's 3-stage learning model. Here, right, the fixation and diversification stage is going to be, or at least where they're going to be, is predicated upon whether or not the skill is more of a closed skill or more of an open skill. For closed skills that take place in more of a fixed, stable environment, right, they're going to enter more of kind of this fixation stage. And the example provided in the text is shooting a free throw, where this is a very closed environment and there's not a high degree of inter-trial variability. So as a practitioner, we really want to create more of like a rote practice, right? Many attempts doing the same exact thing to kind of just replicate that, right? The diversification stage, right, is going to be more so for an open skill, right? And the example is kind of shooting a hockey puck in a game, right? Shooting a hockey puck in a game is going to require somebody to understand a variety of different things, understand various defenses, understand the goalie and how he's positioning him or herself, right? And because of that, you're going to create this diverse array of practice attempts on net, something along those lines. All right. So now, again, I'm trying to move quickly to create this short PowerPoint for you guys. How do we know if learning has actually occurred, right? That's kind of hard, okay? Well, if we have this movement pattern, right? Well, what about attention? Attention is a pretty strong giveaway that a level of learning has occurred. Can they hold a conversation while doing something, right? So think about, you guys just submitted your first teaching demo, right? And hopefully you guys, chose something that was somewhat challenging. Early on, right, do you think somebody was able to hold a conversation when you introduced a skill to them? Probably not, right? Think about what we did in class, where I had one of the students essentially try to distract you while you did a task, okay? If somebody can hold a conversation fairly easily, there's probably somewhere within the associative or autonomous stage of learning, right? Can they multitask, right? Or can they start to think about strategy, right, while doing the task, okay? Knowledge and memory, right? I'm not really sure what that bullet point represents, so I'll have to kind of circle back to that, or I'm not really sure off the top of my head. But error detection and correction, once again, right? If they know what the mistake was and they know the solution, right, we've probably identified that learning has occurred. And then lastly, self-confidence, right? As somebody goes to do something, is there a high degree of self-efficacy as they approach that skill? It's probably because they are somewhere on the higher end of the learning spectrum. Improvements in movement patterns, right? So as somebody is going through that learning process, right, these are some things you may start to recognize. The text starts to talk about freezing the degrees of freedom, and I think we've talked about that already, right? And what essentially we're talking about is control and coordination, right? You can look up the definitions in the text of control and coordination on your own, okay? But what we're talking about is, in a given movement pattern, something like swimming, right? We've got this really limitless range of movement opportunities, and that's what degrees of freedom is, right? Just completely limitless range. With regards to swimming, right, we could talk about the elbow swing, where we've got a high elbow, we bend at the elbow, we get the shoulder up into a high amount of flexion, it comes forward, and then we pull down towards our body with the elbow, we think about what we're doing with the hand, whatever it is. When somebody's learning, right, we freeze the degrees of freedom. We freeze the amount of possibilities by kind of like limiting what we do at our given joints and structures. So with regards to a new learner, what do we teach them? Right? Just go straight arms. And I just say big circles, big circles, big circles with the arm. Is it the true way to learn an appropriate freestyle? No, but we're freezing the degrees of freedom to try to simplify the problem, right? More fluid muscle activity. So as somebody starts to learn, right, it just starts to look right, right? It's harder to say other than, yeah, that looks right, okay? And that's because the sequencing starts to be done properly, right? More efficient energy expenditure, right? Going back to swimming, right? If you see a new learner learning how to swim, it might take them, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes to swim across an entire 25-yard pool, right? Now imagine that energy expenditure, right? I mean, I'm on the extreme end here, but imagine somebody that's like just learning to swim, they barely know how to swim, the cost of nearly drowning while swimming across the pool, right? That energy expenditure is incredibly high versus a very proficient swimmer that can do it 25 yards in, I don't know, 10 seconds, something like that, probably less, right? That energy expenditure is going to be far more efficient. Okay, so it's going to have less of an energetic cost. And then finally, increased consistency, right? Really indicates a relative permanent change. The question I pose here is, what happens if the pattern is incorrect? Well, that kind of goes back to chapter 4, right, when we talked about dynamic learning and attractor basins, right, and how we want a stable system. Deep attractor basins are difficult to correct, so our goal is to always kind of stop and address any issues early on so we don't instill incorrect movement patterns, and then they're much more difficult to change later on. This is just a picture of the degrees of freedom. You could go back to your text and take a look at this. All right, so now we're looking at attention, right? Attention to skill execution. We're going to talk about probably the same example a few times on these back ends of the slides, but as proficiency develops, the need to attend consciously to each aspect of the movement decreases. Where really, again, you know, when you're teaching someone something early on, you might give them various forms of feedback and various cues, right? With the clean, it could be jump and stomp. It could be keep the bar close. It could be use your lats, whatever it is. But once they learn the movement and become proficient, there's probably less of a degree of a need for those cues because things become automatic, right? The learners can focus on other factors of performance. Allocation of visual attention, right? So skilled performers can now attend to relevant areas. So with regards to team sports, we can focus on the defenders, right? Beginners have difficulty discriminating between relevant and irrelevant cues, right? So think about like a beginner focusing on the backboard in basketball, which potentially is inappropriate, right? So as I just alluded to in the prior slide, right, once a learner has mastered a skill, should we continue to use the cues that got them to that skill? Think about that for a second. Once someone has mastered a skill, right, we gave them various cues, they've now mastered it, they're proficient, should we continue to use those cues? And the answer is probably not. Right? This is taken directly from your textbook, and I do want to read this. When a performer consciously focused on the specifics of a well-learned skill that is normally performed automatically, the information needed to coordinate the muscle pattern becomes slowed. The resulting performance becomes hesitant and choppy. And my example here in this bullet point towards the bottom is my story of my athlete at States, right? As I've probably spoken about him, right? Manny was the best hurdler in all of New York State. And he was actually the fastest hurdler in the history of New York State. Going into the New York State Championships, right? We had a lot of quality practices, and I continued to throw a lot of cues at him. Oh, focus on pushing, especially with regards to his start, because that was his strength, right? His start. Push the ground, have a negative step, whatever it is. And I gave him all sorts of cues. And I can tell you, right, both between the trials and the finals, his start was not his strength. In fact, he had a terrible start, and despite being the fastest hurdler in the history of New York State, he ended up losing the New York State Championship. And part of that I just blame is myself. I think I over-cued him going into the New York State Championship. I had him focusing on these things that he had just done naturally, and he had done them naturally really, really well after our prior 2 years of practice. And for whatever reason, I had kind of went back to cueing him on these things. Oh, don't forget to push, don't forget to push. And it became hesitant, or he became hesitant, right? The initial few steps to the hurdles became choppy, and he did not run anywhere near as fast as he should have at the New York State Championships, and he lost, really. So the textbook talks about a non-awareness strategy. The example they provide is a clinician, right? So imagine going into a clinic and you've got walking problems for whatever reason. I don't know if it's pain with the knee, your foot, whatever it is. And as a clinician, you say, oh, walk across this room for me, right? Now, if the client knows that you are looking at their walking gait, they might all of a sudden start walking differently. Maybe they start going heel to toe more, or maybe they just start doing more of an arm swing, whatever it is. So really what you want to do is just say, oh, go walk over to that table, and then I'll see you in a minute. And then while they're not aware, right, you're actually evaluating their gait while they're not aware. Okay. All right, we're going to skip this slide because we want to get to the back end on testing. Measuring progress. We do have tools at our disposal to assess if learning has taken place. And I'm big on assessment, right? My statement is, if you ain't assessing, you're just guessing, right? Some of the assessment methods we have are performance curves, retention tests, and transfer tests. So looking at performance curves, right? This is simply like you take, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6 different performances and you plot them on a curve, right? The most common, what should we take away from this slide? Because it's the only one I'm going to really speak to. The most common performance curve is this negative accelerating curve, right? We've got time on the x-axis, we've got performance on the y-axis. Let's just say we've got, I don't know, 3 points in time. Someone learns a skill, right? Point 1. Someone continues to practice in the middle, point 2, and then point 3. What you see is from practice 1 to practice 2 is there's a massive improvement in performance, kind of like what we talked about. And then from practice 2 to practice 3, the rate of return, right, is far decreased. It's kind of like the law of diminishing returns. And then imagine if there was a 4th practice, right, there's a very, very, very small improvement in overall performance. And this is by far the most common, right? So that's all we really should know about performance curves. There are some limitations of performance curves, right? And, you know, remind me in class, we can go over these in class and I could give you an example of performance curves in class, but what we should recognize is that performance curves do represent just temporary effects because you are looking usually at like 1, 2, or potentially 3 trials that represent a given performance, right? It doesn't really establish permanence of learning, right? And you could see they're constructed from measurements that are often obtained by calculating the mean of a few trials. Well, what about the variability, right? If let's say you do 3 trials and then you plot the average of the 3, well, what about the one that maybe deviated, I don't know, distinctly in the negative direction, right? Sure, it's going to drop that average, but does that represent, you know, learning? I don't know. There are some limitations to that. And I think this is the final slide or two that we're going to discuss, retention and transfer tests, right? These are used to infer that a relatively permanent change in performance has occurred, and what essentially we're talking about for retention and transfer tests, a retention test, right, is when we have an initial pretest, as you can see here, there's a given practice period followed by a post-test. There then has to be a period of time in which we do not practice a skill, but we revisit it, maybe 3 days later, maybe a week later, and then we test them again. So for example, let's say we were learning to juggle, right? I give you a practice test and see how many you can do in a row. Then we practice for whatever it is, 2 hours. And then we do a post test and see how many you can do in a row. And maybe you go from 2 to 10 times in a row. Well, let's come back an entire week later. Can you still come close to 10 in a row, or can you beat that initial pretest, right? If you can still do 8 to 10, we would imply that learning has taken place via that transfer test, or excuse me, via that retention test, right? And a transfer test is kind of what we've talked about a little bit, right? It measures the degree to which a learner can adapt a skill to a different performance or situation, right? So, I mean, the example could be dribbling. Can you dribble a layup, going in for a layup without a defender? Well, does that transfer to a game when you have a defender, right? So that could be a transfer test looking at a skill in a different performance situation. All right, that is it. I wanted to keep this to 30 minutes, so I will see you all next week.